And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. In remembrance of the World Refugee Day, I talked to someone who's been in the front line of saving those fleeing danger with no place to run. A former international president of Doctors Without Borders tells us about hope amid devastation.
The demands of the population.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Today is World Refugee Day. According to the UN, nearly 69 million people were forcibly displaced last year, and among them, about 25 million are refugees. Recently, the fate of a rescue ship of migrants has again roiled Europe. Italy and Malta refused to entry to the Aquarius rescue ship operated by the aid groups SOS Mediterranean Sea and Doctors Without Borders. The 106 migrants on board had to endure days of bickering before finally being taken in by Spain on Sunday. The incident reignited a continent-wide debate over how to handle immigration. The discussion will continue at the EU summit later this month as EU's 29 members are closer, if possible at all, to agreeing on a solution. One of the organizations that took part in operating the rescue ship is Doctors Without Borders. Earlier, I interviewed the former international president of this organization. Since 1995, he has been dedicated with unvarying passion and commitment to saving those in need in Afghanistan, Somalia, and everywhere in between. I met him in Beijing to recall his incredible journey. Although he is a tough nut to crack, the good doctor eventually opened up about the atrocities he has seen. How much difference can you guys make?
I think we all need to understand something. That, David Reef and others have talked about humanitarian action being emblematic of failure. The reason humanitarians are taking risks to provide health care and other assistance in very dangerous parts of the world because politics has failed. If we had communities that could live in peace side by side, or if we had governments that were responsive to the needs of people, or if we had a United Nations that really worked and were able to broker peace between warring factions and countries, then there would be very little need for humanitarian workers to take such, to provide assistance in large scale.
That makes it work very challenging, but at the same time, you have to be very skillful when you're in a crisis. You have to deal with all kinds of players. You have to make them understand that you guys are neutral. But in a crisis, particularly in a war, it's very hard.
The way humanitarian agencies get access to remote parts of the world, to places where there's conflict going on, is by convincing various authorities. It could be the government, it could be whatever faction is in control of a particular area. You have to convince them of your neutrality.
How would you convince?
Let's say Afghanistan. In 2004, we had 5 of our colleagues who were killed, and we decided to leave the country at that time because we felt the deaths didn't result in the kind of action that we expected from authorities. So in working in Afghanistan today, it's not just enough to convince the Afghan government, because we know that the Afghan government controls Kabul and a few other major cities, right? Big part of Afghanistan is still controlled by Taliban. So you have to, ultimately, in any of the places where we work, it has to be in their interest, or they have to see the benefit of allowing an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières into their region or into their area.
But how? The question is how?
Even rebel groups have they have to get the population to side with them. And the way they do that is by providing them with services, because they have some of the same compulsions that governments have. They are also subject to the demands of the population under their control. They also need health care, etc., right? So there is pressure not just on governments, but also on all sorts of other authorities for services to be provided. In my first mission in Ethiopia, for example, right, we were working in an area that was affected. This was in 1995. There was conflict between the Tigrayan people in the north and with the Somali people. We have, on occasions, have had to negotiate between these armed groups, especially in 95 and early 96, where we would get them to stop fighting for a day or two so that children in certain areas could be vaccinated. That is almost impossible today. The world has changed. There's been a proliferation of NGOs. It has also become a big humanitarian industrial complex, so to speak. $28 billion spent last year in humanitarian assistance. The number of NGOs that are in the field today have, multiplied exponentially. They all have, very different interests. I might talk about principles, but not all organizations are as principled as they should be. Many of them are not independent because they rely on governments for their funding. So all of that has actually changed the way that people in countries view NGOs. They're not always seen, at least today, as the impartial, independent NGOs that we think we are.
Do you have to make extra effort in order to convince people?
Yes, we have to. Part of the problem is also, so for example, I'll go back to Afghanistan again. We've had several situations where the government or the ISAF forces and Afghan government tried to imply that humanitarian agencies are a soft power to their hard power. That means that they're working together, they do the hard work and we do the soft work. And we are not, because the ISAF is a party to war. So if you are taking your cues and your orders and getting your funding from the government and from, let's say, the US government, then you've already chosen your sides. You're no longer neutral, right? So these sort of narratives actually lead the population to believe that you're not neutral, and also what that also does is you then become a target of war. You then become legitimate targets,
right? Because
you're no longer neutral.
At least not perceived.
Not perceived to be neutral. And this is also what happened in Iraq at some point. And I remember in 2013, these were the days before the big massive violence, a lot of people killing and being killed in bomb blasts, etc. I traveled by road from Basra to Baghdad, about 900 kilometers, I think, and it was fine. But as I reached Baghdad, there were US convoy tankers that were bombed, and that were blasted by an RPG. I personally felt safe because I'm an Indian. Indians had no stake in Iraq. But 1 week later, just 1 week later, on the same road, an ICRC vehicle was stopped. Yeah. ICRC worker was pulled out of the car and killed, and he was Sri Lankan. He probably looked just like me, and the driver's hands were cut off. And then you realize that false sense of security that you had. And a few weeks later, the UN office was bombed in Baghdad. And Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the head of the office, we shared the same birthday, and I knew him from the year that I had worked in Azerbaijan. So these are the moments when you really doubt yourself and the work that you do, because suddenly all of the risk and the danger and everything comes very close to home. And it makes it very for me it was very difficult to go back to Iraq for a while after that, even though I personally didn't face any danger, but that
what happened later.
Yeah, that false sense of security you had was somehow, that bubble had burst, and it became very difficult for me to go back to Iraq for a while after that.
Is your mom and your beloved ones also convinced about your cause?
They were always worried. Every time I get into a plane to go to Colombia, I used to go to Colombia a lot, and there was at that time the risk of kidnapping was very high, and I would make a mental note. Well, if I'm kidnapped for 6 months, I learn Spanish. If I'm kidnapped for a year, I would, do something else. So I would make these mental notes, because you have to approach, because there is a risk involved in everything you do. But I'm also comforted by the fact that as an organization, we take these risks very seriously, and we really make attempts to mitigate the risk as much as possible.
So under the current circumstances, Unni, how do your organizations protect yourself?
In all of the places where we work at the moment, we do not have armed guards. And I go back to what I mean. It's a constant conversation with different authorities and stakeholders in the country.
It must be frustrating. I mean, you always have to tell people, we are neutral. We are neutral, and we are neutral. We are here for your benefits. Even though you are practicing it all the time, people are still not trusting you.
But that is what we do. That is what keeps us safe. And I can
What do you
say
mean by that?
That sitting every day, drinking endless cups of coffees and tea with the people, and then trying to tell them, and you're being quizzed about your finances. Where does your money come from? Who supports you? All of these, they really get into details, and they ask you all of this before they make a decision whether they should allow you in or not. And the truth is, today, in some of the most difficult parts of the world, in Syria, in Somalia, in the Maghreb, in many of these places, it is actually not that easy to provide humanitarian assistance. It's actually dangerous. So then you have to make the decision on what amount of risk you should take.
Unni, you've been working in Somalia for quite some time.
Yes.
You leave the people there.
Like I said, my first mission was with the Somali people in eastern Ethiopia.
So when you announced that, what was it like for you?
It was a very emotional moment. One of the saddest moments of my 20 years with MSF was in August 2013, when I had to announce that we were pulling out of Somalia. Because if any population in this world requires humanitarian assistance today, that's Somalis.
Yeah.
Right? There was a dire need for assistance. We knew that when we left Somalia, there would be large parts of the country with no access to healthcare. We knew people would die because there was no healthcare. But we had also reached a point where it was getting very difficult to keep our teams safe.
Do you still remember some of the Somalians you met?
Yes, and in fact, the Somali staff that worked for Médecins Sans Frontières, they were very upset, and I think rightly so. They trust and believe in an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières to meet the needs of people in Somalia, but even they left. And that was a big letdown, and I feel that as well.
For your work, these kind of debts just keep on piling up, the emotional debts. What is it like for you, for someone who's working in that organization, who are leading the team?
It is only natural, I think, that if you spend a lot of time doing this kind of work, you become very cynical, you start questioning the utility of the work at all, because we've been working in South Sudan for 30 years, and the outlook for South Sudan today is no better than perhaps what it was 30 years ago, right? But at the same time, the opposite. Do we not do anything? Do we let these people die? Do we not stand in solidarity with these people when they're going through the most difficult time? What makes me do this work, or continue to do this work, is the strong belief that we are standing with people when waiting for politicians and others to find solutions to the problem.
But you're also providing, some would argue,
Yes.
the opportunity for the politicians, for example, not to seek a solution because situations are not getting as worse as they could.
No, I would really object to that characterization. I think it's like, you know, you have a daughter and she falls ill and you take her to the emergency room, and 1 year later she falls ill and then you take her to the emergency room. Well, I mean, one could say, what's the point in patching her up, because every year she's coming to the emergency room. That is not the way.
It's not the logic.
That's not the logic. We are standing with people, or standing in solidarity with people when they're going through the worst periods in their lives. Meanwhile, we have a world order, we have the United Nations. Their job is to find solutions. And unfortunately, the UN today is more of a debating chamber than a place where decisions are made and enforced.
When you are in frustrated situations, how do you convince yourself once again about your cause? How do you get out of those personal psychological disasters?
So very often the reality sinks in after you leave. On the ground, you are very busy. You're working, your work starts in the morning and it ends when you hit your bed. But what keeps me alive is those individuals, the boy that survived malnutrition, the men we treated from sleeping sickness in Congo-Brazzaville. These individual faces then stick in my mind, and that's what helps you get over. It's never really Somalis or the context, it's those faces that you see that makes you want to go on.
20 years after that, you are taking a temporary break, it seems. But now, if you reflect back upon your professional career with Médecins Sans Frontières, what are some of the major points you think we can share?
I never saw this as a career. I wanted to do it for a year, but then I went back for another year, and then before I knew it, it was 20 years, and now it's 22 years. So I never saw it as a career. It was more like a vocation, something that I was compelled to do, right?
The passion there.
A passion, or the feeling that you cannot sit by when all of this is going on. You cannot sit by and not do anything, right? And very often I have to admit that we don't always know whether we're doing the right thing. We know the right thing medically. We know if you give this vaccination, then you prevent this disease. We know if you treat a person for malaria, that person will survive. But the overall assistance, providing, there have been instances where journalists have written about perhaps aid work prolongs. So these are considerations, but these are all the luxury. With the hindsight, you can make these determinations whether aid was successful or not. But at that moment, when people are suffering, I am proud, or I am glad that we have doctors and nurses who are willing to act.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.